Good afternoon. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and on behalf of the center, I'd like to welcome all of you today to today's webinar on safe and effective COVID-19 vaccination, the path from here. We are living in a truly extraordinary time in the midst of this pandemic with an unprecedented global effort underway, efforts in the United States, efforts around the world to rapidly develop vaccines for COVID-19. That's what will take us out of this pandemic. And if you go to the next slide, many vaccines have already entered large-scale clinical trials. This is an unprecedented pace, not so much because what is being done is fundamentally different. What is more different is the way it's being done with a parallel process going on, whereas I'll talk more about in a moment. FDA and other regulatory agencies have issued guidance and to provide some clarity ahead of time about what is needed to show a safe and effective vaccine. Lots of effort has been invested by the NIH and other research agencies around the world to set up large clinical trial networks to conduct studies of the vaccine candidates that show promise in people more quickly than ever before. And as all of that is going on, large-scale manufacturing is taking place so that when the vaccines are determined to be safe and effective by the FDA and other global regulatory agencies, there will not necessarily be any significant delay as manufacturing ramps up before the vaccine can be used on a progressively more widespread basis. And here in the United States, 6 major vaccines have this kind of co-investment by the government. Clinical trials are either underway or starting very soon. And these are not just the early stage trials, but we're getting towards large-scale pivotal trials of vaccine candidates, a wide range, an unprecedented range of platforms for vaccines with literally hundreds of millions of doses in the process of being manufactured now. This is truly an unprecedented effort, and it understandably has raised concerns, especially in a high political season like we're living in now, about whether the regulatory standards being used to guide this development process and ultimately the availability of vaccines is being implemented effectively. We go to the next slide. FDA has some well-established mechanisms for approving vaccines, for determining safety and effectiveness for a product approval. These long-standing regulatory practices recognize that vaccines are going to be given to large numbers of people who are mostly healthy. And therefore, the standards for determining safety and effectiveness are very different from a medical product like convalescent plasma or an antiviral that's given to very sick patients who are in the hospital. And FDA has tried to take steps to be very clear about how these regulatory practices are going to be applied in this unique COVID-19 context, including through issuing a detailed written guidance about its standards and processes for approving a new vaccine that came out in June 2020. This guidance, the development and licensure of vaccines to prevent COVID-19, set benchmarks for the conditions under which FDA would give a full vaccine approval. It proposed that a vaccine study needed to be designed to show that a vaccine was at least 50% effective in reducing serious cases and complications from COVID. And the guidance also set FDA's expectations about how trials should be conducted, how safety data should be collected, and how diverse populations should be included in these trials, including racial and ethnic minorities and elderly individuals who've been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. The guidance also laid out expectations around manufacturing, again, very much in the FDA's tradition for vaccine regulation. And at the same time, the FDA also said that it has or stated how it would expect to apply its emergency use authorization authority. This is an authority available to the FDA to make a product available potentially under less stringent conditions of evidence regarding safety and effectiveness than is required for a full approval. Still needs to reflect the evidence available, the potential benefits outweighing the known and potential risks, still needs to reflect manufacturing quality and reliability, but this is a mechanism that can be used potentially for a vaccine, perhaps in a more specific, narrower population of higher risk individuals such as healthcare workers, and part of perhaps a incremental or gradual strategy for making a vaccine more available. And the FDA specific guidance here said that for a vaccine for which there is adequate manufacturing information, issuance of an emergency use authorization may be appropriate once the clinical studies have demonstrated the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. And that language would seem to mean after the clinical studies have shown significant benefits, as I was just describing, in reducing the rate and severity of COVID infections, having a sufficient safety database along with that, it would be potentially before the submission and formal review of the full application. So FDA has written guidance about this. This has come up a lot, but understandably, with so much at stake, there are a lot of questions about how this will actually work in practice from here, now that we have so many vaccines in advanced stages of development, and talk about vaccines potentially being approved under emergency use as well in a matter of weeks to months. On the next slide, I want to emphasize again that this is a process that has a long-standing history of experience at FDA and experience in effective regulation. So whatever path is taken from here, as many of you may have seen in this USA Today op-ed that was released today by the career staff leaders at the FDA, the career staff at FDA has a firm commitment to following effective scientific principles, and you'll be hearing today from some of the leaders of the FDA Center for Biologics that is in the process of applying these FDA standards and principles to the vaccine development that is taking place right now and is so important for the steps from here for vaccine availability and public confidence in those vaccines. You're also going to hear today from me and 3 other former commissioners of the Food and Drug Administration from every administration, Republican and Democrat, over the last 2 decades, who have seen how the FDA works in practice and know how important these FDA standards and professionalism are for the effective regulation of medical products that people can be confident about. And you're also going to hear from others who have perspectives and experience on these issues as we move forward into these next critical weeks for vaccine development and potential availability. So to the next slide. We're going to talk about some of the current topics and some of these topics looking forward, like these clinical trials that are underway, more details about FDA's expectations for approving a COVID-19 vaccine, definitely some discussion of emergency use authorization and how it might apply in this context as opposed to situations where drugs might be used in severely ill patients. We'll talk about expectations about the process from here and what the public can expect that they'll be able to hear about it at each step of the way as more evidence becomes available. And then expectations about what happens after an approval or an emergency use authorization for continuing to expand the evidence after a vaccine is approved. And most importantly, we want to bring it back to the American public, what people need to know now and how they can stay informed and how they can help others stay informed about these important developments related to COVID-19 vaccines. So next slide. This is an overview for the agenda. We're going to start out talking with Peter Marks, who is the director of the Center for Biologics at FDA. We'll then have a chance to hear from a number of further perspectives on FDA assessments of COVID-19 vaccines. And then in our last session, we're going to look ahead based on the evidence that we expect to get, based on how we expect the process to go from here. What are the implications for vaccine distribution, access, and monitoring, and what else should we be thinking about in this process? So those are some of the topics that are ahead for us. After just a few more housekeeping notes. This webcast is being recorded. It's going to be available on our website after the event. The participants are going to be muted. All of you who are listening are going to be muted for the duration of the event, but we are going to get to some good questions and discussion. We do want to hear from you at Duke Margolis afterwards. If you have any follow-up questions, we're going to be staying with this topic. And just for disclosure purposes, I'm a member of the Johnson & Johnson Board of Directors. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who we'll be hearing from a little bit later, is a member of the Pfizer Board of Directors, which do have vaccine candidates in this process of development. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to turn to our fireside chat now by introducing Peter Marks, as I mentioned, the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA, and also my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Margaret or Peggy Hamburg, who's now Foreign Secretary at the National Academy of Medicine and the former FDA commissioner as well. And Peter, let me start with you. We've provided some introduction here. There's a lot of attention nationally around the FDA standards for approval of a new vaccine. What would you like to highlight about the FDA's safety and effectiveness determinations for moving forward with vaccines to approval or emergency use?
Yeah, well, I just want to back it up for a moment to say that everything we're going to do, first of all, I want to thank you for hosting this because clearly there's a tremendous amount of interest in this area. And we really appreciate the opportunity to participate today. But I do want to back it up a moment to say that, you know, as we do things at FDA, they're all focused ultimately around the fact that we have to make sure that we have a safe and effective vaccine that people will trust enough to want to take. I mean, vaccine confidence is critical here. And although until more recently, I never thought of that as one of the most important things we can do. It's very clear here that ensuring that we do our jobs right so that people have the needed confidence in the output from our evaluation is key. So for us, we are going to be looking to make sure that whatever comes through the process here meets our standards for quality, safety, and effectiveness. And there's been a lot of discussion here over, you know, is this going to be something like an emergency use authorization? Will it be a low level of evidence? Will it be like a biologics license application, a high level of evidence? And I think the most important top line message from my perspective today is that for us, for a vaccine for which there is adequate manufacturing information, if we are going to do an emergency use authorization, it's going to really be like an emergency use authorization plus. Okay, it may be appropriate once studies have demonstrated that the key findings of safety and effectiveness of the vaccine are similar to those that would be appropriate for BLA, but those data might be before the manufacturer submitted all of the various data elements that we normally be required for a BLA and for which the FDA would normally have completed its formal review of a BLA. So in essence, on this continuum between EUA, which has a relatively low bar, the statutory standard is it's a product that may be effective and for which the potential benefits and known and potential risks are such that the benefits outweigh those risks. And the BLA standard, which is substantial evidence of effectiveness from adequate and well-controlled trials, along that spectrum, it's going to be closer to the BLA, even if it's not exactly identical. Why wouldn't it be exactly identical? Because the amount of manufacturing information, the amount of secondary analyses, data tables, administrative work, conformance, all sorts of manufacturing stuff that has to go into that, the length of the safety follow-up, all of that for a typical license application won't be there at the time. But the substantial information about efficacy and the most important information regarding safety will be there.
And just as a quick follow-up, and then I want to bring in Peggy, that information about safety and efficacy that you're talking about. So that's a large number of people enrolled in trials with significant safety information available. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that. And then for effectiveness, as I understand it, you're looking for demonstrating a 50% reduction in actual rates of infection or significant infection and reduction in severity at least. And that's the standard for approval that you've laid out, and sounds like something similar is applying if in the emergency use context as well.
Yeah. We stated in the guidance that we're going to, so one does not normally in guidance, in vaccine guidances, put down a chit for how effective a vaccine should be. That's kind of a novel thing to do here, but we decided that in this particular case, it made sense to do because there is, in this middle of this pandemic, there is an opportunity cost to a vaccine that is less than optimally effective. It means that people are going to go out and start using something that may not bring them the kind of protection that they could get from a vaccine that was more optimally protective. So we came up with this 50% number. 50% is, we felt very reasonable. 50% is about the efficacy of flu vaccine in a good year. And so could it be better? People could argue it could be, you could ask for better. Could you say, well, something is better than nothing? Could it be lower? Yeah, but we came up with this idea, 50% efficacy over placebo, and the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval needs to be greater than 30%. What does that mean? What that means is basically this trial needs to be large enough so that there's statistical power, so that you're not going to have effects that could be anywhere from 50% down to 0, right? It could be anywhere across it. In this case, it's 50% down to 30% is the 95% lower bound of the 95% confidence interval, which says that the trial size is going to be big. And in fact, the trial size for the trials going on right now is about 30,000 for the large trials, phase 3 trials going on in the United States. 50-50 in some of them, you know, in terms of who's randomized to vaccine versus placebo. Others are doing 2-to-1, but it's close enough. You're going to have a very large number of patients who are receiving the active vaccine for a safety data set between 15 and 20,000, which is a large safety data set. And we'll have efficacy, which will be event-driven. The number of times people get a COVID-19 infection, for example. So these are event-driven trials, relatively large data sets, and when they meet the number of events, that is when it will be appropriate to potentially submit either an emergency use authorization request or a biologics license application request.
Peggy?
Thank you. Well, first let me say a thanks to Mark for organizing this, and also to you, Peter, for making yourself available and your team. I think it is so important to try to bring additional clarity and understanding about the vaccine R&D process and the FDA regulatory review and approval procedures. And, you know, as you identified correctly as you began, at the end of the day, trust and confidence is absolutely essential, because even if we have a safe and effective vaccine, if people don't believe in it, people don't trust it, people don't have confidence in it, it won't be used, and it won't be the tool we're all counting on to help us effectively manage and control this devastating global pandemic. So let me, with that as background, just drill down a little bit deeper into the discussion that you've been having about the emergency use authorization, because I think that is one of the things that's raising concerns, and it's not something that is immediately clear to people that haven't been deeply immersed in some of these issues over many years. and the criteria was presented, and you talked about sort of where on the continuum from what the letter of the law might allow you to do with the emergency use authorization to where you think you'll end up closer to really meeting the standards for safety and efficacy in the pivotal trials that would be required for the BLA, but almost as a bridging to the administrative requirements to complete the BLA license. But people are confused about the idea of an events-driven trial and the notion that the trial could be stopped before it was fully enrolled if certain criteria in terms of events, new infections were met. What does that mean? That tells you something about efficacy. What does that mean in terms of expectations for safety data in that population that had enrolled to date? What amount of follow-up might you be looking for before you would stop the trial? When would the Data Safety Monitoring Board, how does that work? I think people don't fully understand about Data Safety Monitoring Boards and their role. So a little bit more about, you know, what we might see unfold as these studies go forward. And then if you did issue an EUA, would you anticipate that it would be targeted in terms of the populations that would be likely to get it? And then just to add one more thing to the long list of questions, maybe say a little bit about what you would anticipate is the impact of one vaccine reaching that stage of being issued an EUA on other ongoing clinical studies.
And you're on mute, Peter, so.
I'm going to back up a little bit here. So let me just back up to the trial. So that we have trials underway. Some trials will get started on other vaccines, but so the trials are going along, and what is happening is the event of interest is people are getting COVID-19. The event occurs, we don't know whether the person who's gotten COVID-19 was getting the vaccine, the active vaccination, or the placebo. After that happens a certain number of times, and in this case, for most of these trials, there's an interim analysis after something like that happens at 70 or 80 times, and the final analysis happens after it's roughly happened about 150 or so times, and that's just based on the statistical calculations here. After that happens, the Data Safety Monitoring Board, which is a group of basically impartial individuals that are put together to look at the safety of the trial and to evaluate the conduct of the trial, they will potentially be unblinded, and they will be able to understand whether the vaccine helped prevent COVID-19 relative to the placebo. And at that point, they would make a recommendation. They could make any one of a number of recommendations. They could recommend, let's start from the worst and move to the best. They could recommend that the trial just needs to stop because there's futility, that the number of events were equally distributed in the people who got vaccinated and the people who got the placebo, saying that there's no effect, and they'll just say, sorry, no point in enrolling anyone anymore. They could say, well, looks close to getting successful, but not quite over the mark. We need to keep the trial blinded and continue to move along, and essentially let the trial mature out. Or they could say, okay, well, we've reached our efficacy goal here, and say that it's potentially possible to submit an emergency use authorization, or depending on what the exact findings were, consider whether it could be appropriate for some type of other regulatory submission. But I think the major thing people are looking for here is getting enough data to get towards an emergency use authorization at some interim analysis. Now, once they make that decision, the sponsor of that trial will then put the data together. And what they will then have is the efficacy data. They'll also have the safety data that's accrued up till that point. And given these trials, we're expecting that we're going to have about a median. That is, about 50% of people will have more, 50% of people will have less than about 2 months of follow-up on people. That's what we're hoping for. It turns out that most of the adverse events that will occur after vaccination will occur in a time frame of about 1.5 months after vaccination. That's not to say that events couldn't occur later, and that's why with any plan that we have for any type of emergency use authorization or biologics license application approval, there will be a pharmacovigilance plan that will continue to look at adverse events going on after that. And you know, that would be the case for a vaccine with just a few months of follow-up at the time of our regulatory action, or even if we had a year of that follow-up, because we always put in place pharmacovigilance for new vaccines. So at the time of an emergency use authorization, there'll be efficacy data that's met an interim analysis endpoint, and we'd have safety data that would be sufficient on a large number of people. We're talking about something on 15 to 20,000 people that will make us feel reasonably confident that we understand the safety profile of the vaccine. It's not exactly what we would have if we had had 6 months or 12 months or the full 2 years of follow-up, but it's it's close enough and closer to the side of a biologics license application than it is to just the emergency use authorization standard. How will people know that that's okay? How will they know that we're not like holding something and sweeping something under the rug? Well, the way they're going to know that is because any vaccine that we issue an emergency use authorization for will go to a public advisory committee meeting. We have committed to that, and we've committed to that doing it timely for anyone that comes in, because that public process is going to be critical. It'll be critical for people to see what's in the briefing packages. They'll be able to see the discussion among an impartial group of advisors. They'll see the committee recommendation, and they'll see the public dialogue that will take place at that committee. We've made arrangements so that we can do that virtually because we assume that's how we'll be doing it. And then after that, there'll be a recommendation made, and then ultimately FDA would be the one that would decide whether that recommendation should be followed to issue an emergency use authorization. Again, if an emergency use authorization were issued, you asked this question of what population would it be issued in. It would be issued in the population that makes sense based on the population that was studied. Some of the dialogue over who should get the vaccine first will be something that will be discussed and is being discussed by the folks at CDC and others in consultation with the National Academy about what prioritization should be there. It is true that there could be some subset that looks like they benefit most, and we could potentially put that in an emergency use authorization, but I don't know that that's going to be the case. I think we'll just have to see. And ultimately, whatever we do, we'll also have a very robust pharmacovigilance plan with it, so that we are going to be continuing to look for anything that might go awry following the issuance of an emergency use authorization. So that's kind of where we go from beginning to end for a single vaccine. What will happen if 2 weeks later another vaccine comes in and asks for emergency use authorization? Well, we would go through that whole process again. Is one going to necessarily block the other? Probably not. And is one going to necessarily cause unblinding of the other? Hard to say for sure right now, but possibly not. I mean, a lot of this will depend on what kind of data we see, because there's the spectrum of vaccine efficacy between vaccines that are modestly effective to moderately effective, like influenza vaccine, and then the vaccines that are extremely effective, like measles vaccine. And so where this vaccine lies along that spectrum, or anyone lies along that spectrum, will determine somewhat the population is deployed in, and how one then looks at subsequent vaccines. So I'll stop there. I tried to cover a lot of ground.
I squoze in a lot of questions for you. So, but I think it's very helpful to sort of lay out a little bit more how the process is going to unfold, and the various steps along the way, including the DSMB and the advisory committee, in terms of opportunities for independent scientists to look at the data, analyze it, and weigh in.
Peter, you covered a lot of ground on approval and on emergency use and the process that people should expect from here. Like you said, CBER has issued some extraordinarily detailed and complete guidance along the way. Do you expect more guidance coming in writing about this emergency use authorization process?
You may want to stay tuned for that. Those on may want to. Those interested might want to check back frequently on our website and our guidance agenda for CBER, just to see about that. Okay. And in order not to get in trouble with any attorneys at FDA today, I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, well, good to know. Let me turn a little bit more to you talked about this. You talked a lot about effectiveness. You talked some about safety. The groups who are going to be getting this vaccine, at least the groups who seem most likely to benefit, are people with comorbidities, people over 65, communities of color. Could you say a little bit more about how, with the enrollment that you have, the events you're tracking, you're going to be able to provide some confidence about the benefit and risk information on the potential vaccines for those kinds of groups?
Yeah, Mark, thanks so much for that question. I should have really mentioned that. It's really critical that these clinical trials reflect, the enrollment reflects the cross-section of our country, because everyone is going to need to be, everyone is going to need to potentially be eligible for vaccination, which means the clinical trials need to have the same kind of diversity as the diversity of our country. And that includes minorities, different ethnicities, and different ages, women who are of childbearing potential or even pregnant, and then ultimately pediatrics as well. So we really have worked to stress to the manufacturers that they need to have plans in place to do what they can to make sure that there's an adequate Latinx enrollment, an adequate African American enrollment, that they do what they can, their best to increase Native American, Native Alaskan enrollment, and then also to have a population of older individuals that are enrolled as well. I can say that my impression of the entire trial, the entire trial scenario going on right now is that getting older individuals to participate has not been the great challenge. And actually, the Latinx enrollment has not been quite as much of a challenge as really working towards getting the minority, African American minority enrollment in these trials. So we're working with the manufacturers, the sponsors, to try to help them develop plans. I know many of them have tried to develop their own plans, and we'll help as we can to try to make sure we make that as robust as possible. We're very excited that some in the community are working with us, have reached out to us to try to help us achieve this by, I think one of the things that just needs to happen here is just information is really helpful, and taking away some of the mystery here of what's going on. and also reminding people about vaccines and how much they can contribute. One of the things I'm just going to take a digression for a moment to say that vaccines are a victim of their own success. Because for those who have never suffered through measles and chickenpox, and by the way, if you can see, I've got the scars on my forehead from my bout with measles and chickenpox, which came 2 weeks apart from each other. Now you know about my medical history. People don't understand that people actually died from measles. They don't understand that smallpox killed a lot of people. And that polio maimed a lot of people. And so the power of vaccines has been underappreciated. And now suddenly we have this opportunity to help people understand vaccines can make a tremendous difference if we have the confidence in them to use them. And so really, I think from my perspective, we need to be as absolutely transparent. There is no stupid question here that from anyone about this. We need to be as forthcoming of data as we possibly can. And from my perspective, short of trade secret manufacturing information, we're going to encourage the manufacturers to be absolutely transparent with data. We obviously also can't identify individual patients. We have to protect privacy, but to the extent that we can have as transparent a process here, we need to do that because it's just absolutely critical that we put aside all of the noise that we've been hearing. There's all sorts of cacophony about blah, 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 vaccine, blah, 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 bad, blah, 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 blah. No, we need to get that cacophony needs to go away. We need to understand that there are scientists here at FDA, and you'll be hearing from Marian Gruber, who's the head of the Office of Vaccines. These people are so committed to making sure that what comes through this process is safe enough for their own families, and they want it to be safe for everyone's family, just like for their own family. And those people who have that incredible commitment, it's really important that people know that is going to be out there, that what comes through this process is going to have that type of scientific spotlight put on it so that people are comfortable knowing that it's a safe vaccine to take that's going to do what it says it's supposed to do.
Thank you, Peter. I might jump in first to say that, I had the great honor and privilege when I was FDA commissioner to work closely with you and with Marian Gruber and her team. And I have to say that, extraordinary professionalism, scientific integrity, expertise, and experience. And that is, I think, very reassuring. In the spirit of, sort of full transparency, I think we would be remiss if we didn't raise with you this recent safety concern that was reported out, an adverse reaction that may or may not be related to the vaccine, but in the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine trials, not in the US, but it might be a good opportunity for you to reflect a little bit about how adverse events are dealt with when they occur in a clinical trial, and sort of what is your sense of what this reported out adverse event might mean.
So I'm not going to speak to a specific manufacturer's issue, but
agreed.
on the broader sense, let's talk about vaccine adverse events. These trials are enrolling thousands of people, and we have to look for things that could potentially be signals, but might not be. And unfortunately, having run large clinical trials before my time at FDA, unfortunately, you don't know sometimes after you do a lot of digging whether something is real or not. But the prudent thing is sometimes to stop and take stock. And I don't think we should ever. There are no demerits for doing that. Okay, this is a safety type of thing. There are certain events that can occur because of natural viral infections. I'm just going to use another hypothetical one. Guillain-Barré syndrome occurs associated with influenza. It also is something that can occur possibly associated with certain influenza vaccines at an increased rate. So one has to sort out what is potentially a background event from something that is truly vaccine related. Sometimes one can't actually tease it out, but we have to make our best effort here to do that. And that's part of doing right by people for the safety of this, so that people understand that we're going to put the microscope on any significant adverse event that occurs, and we're going to try to understand, is this real? Is this related to the vaccine? Is it not? And, you know, there are certain adverse events where, you know, they could be vaccine related. If you see one, well, maybe it's okay to proceed. If you see two, maybe that's getting you more nervous. You see three, maybe you can't go forward. We have to see for any given vaccine, I'm not speaking about a specific vaccine, what we see here, and doing good due diligence is going to be critical here for each of these, because we're very aware that there is this situation here that's a little different with COVID-19 vaccines than your run-of-the-mill vaccine. It's more like a pandemic influenza vaccine, in the fact that we're going to approve a vaccine that's not just going to be used in a few million people or 10 million people, but it's going to be potentially used in hundreds of millions of people. And so we need to be very, very cautious as we see safety signals and do tremendous due diligence here. I know that our Office of Vaccines is going to scrutinize any adverse events that come from any of the trials that are serious and unexpected, to make sure that we really understand what's going on there. And perhaps Dr. Gruber will say more about that later on.
Thank you.
Peter, do you want to maybe say a little bit more about, more generally, so I appreciate the comments on adverse events, but in the last couple of minutes, maybe a bit more about the additional data that you're collecting on safety. And I know some people have concerns that, you know, while you're looking for these significant events and a significant effect, even for an emergency use authorization in a limited population, this is all happening fast. And are there safety concerns that you have about that might be revealed over time? Can you say a little bit more about the safety database and that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so there's going to be so we'll have a relatively large safety database, but it will be a short-term look. As I said before, most adverse events occur within about a month and a half of vaccination. So I think if there are, we're hoping that if we see major ones, we'll see it then. We will have the pharmacovigilance set up, where I think we're in a much better position now than we were even 5 or 10 years ago, because we have large safety databases like the Sentinel system, which have been enhanced now by, in some cases, direct linkage to medical records. And I think Steve Anderson, who's the director of our Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology at the Center for Biologics, he'll be able to say more about this. But being able to identify a signal through claims databases and then refine it by getting linkage to the electronic medical record quickly, I think that's going to help us having in what may be near real-time surveillance. I don't want to be a Pollyanna and say that there's not, you know, that we can't say that there's absolutely going to be perfection here, because there's always a certain amount of risk in everything we do at FDA. And in fact, in some cases, we are very close to the insurance industry in some ways, because we're risk managers, right? And that's why we do benefit risk assessments. And we do have to remember at the end of the day here that we are going to be getting the safest possible vaccine we absolutely can. It is in the background here in terms of benefit risk assessment of a disease which is basically shutting down our lives as we know them and killing off right now roughly 1,000 people a day in the United States, and many more globally. So we do this in this context. Now, because we're giving vaccines to healthy people, we absolutely, are absolutely committed to making sure that the potential adverse effects for that individual, for individual people, are as low as they can be. But as we move forward here, I just think we will look at this and put in place the necessary pharmacovigilance to make sure that there are not signals that come up that would potentially change any benefit risk assessment that we make as we potentially issue an emergency use authorization. Bottom line is, we have to do our jobs, and people need to know that we're doing our jobs so that they'll trust and take these vaccines. Because if we don't have a high vaccination rate, ultimately, we're not going to bring this COVID-19 under the kind of control that it needs to be brought.
Peter, thanks for joining us today and being so transparent about everything you're working on with all else that you have going on. Peggy, Dr. Hamburg, I'd like to give you the last word for this session.
Well, just echo the thanks and say that this is, one of the most important decisions that FDA will probably be undertaking in our lifetimes. This really matters, and we appreciate both the level of intensity and focus that's being brought to it, and really welcome this chance to create a more open discussion environment of what it takes to develop and review a vaccine, and hopefully to help restore a sense of understanding, trust, and confidence in the process and the people who are leading that process. So your time with us is most appreciated, and I think it really does matter.
Thank you very much. And Peggy, thank you too. And now I'd like to turn to our first panel. We're going to talk in more detail about some of these same issues around the development and FDA assessment of COVID vaccines and the implications of those really important actions by the FDA. Pleased to introduce our panelists for this session. Dr. Marian Gruber is the Director of the Office of Vaccines Research and Review at CBER. As Peter mentioned, she's overseeing a lot of these vaccine regulatory issues. We're also joined by Bruce Gellin, President of for Global Immunization at the Sabin Research Institute, Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization with an industry perspective, and my colleague, Dr. Rob Califf, Head of Clinical Policy and Strategy at Google and Verily Health, another former FDA commissioner. And Bruce, I'd like to go to you first. I know you've got a tight timetable today, but so your thoughts based on what you've heard. You previously oversaw the National Vaccine Program at HHS. Based on what you've heard, how does this fit into the bigger challenges and steps ahead for vaccine development?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for organizing this. Let me pick up where Peggy left off. Every decision the FDA makes is an important one. This one is far above the fold, given what's at stake here, given the urgency of the pandemic. I think what's important here, and I've had, as you said, I was at the National Vaccine Program Office for 15 years and had a chance to see how the process works. But I think what's here is that while everybody knows the FDA is the gold standard in the world, and it takes a lot to have a product work its way through that pipeline, which is why they have the confidence in the products that do get through. This is the first time, I think, that the process is really in the bright lights. People have general awareness of that there's a lot of data and there's some decisions that get made and there may be an advisory committee, but here we're looking at the process. And that's something I think that's new to everybody. So the ability to understand that process, to know that how it works, to know how decisions made is critically important. And while Peter has laid out a lot of that, I think we're going to need more of these going through. I appreciate that Peter reinforced that there will be an advisory committee that looks at this. The advantage of advisory committees in the federal government is that they're outside experts who have a chance to kick the tires, ask tough questions, and give their advice. They don't make the decisions, but they give their advice. But as Peter was talking about that, I was thinking about the recent SpaceX, or when I was a kid watching the space launches, there was always a blackboard in the back with a lot of equations. I didn't understand any of those, but there was somebody who translated it. So I think that the VRBPAC discussions are maybe not for the faint of heart, and there may be a need for some interpretation of what's going on, because I think just having a webcast won't be enough, because there'll be a need for that. How that's done, I'll leave it to the FDA to think about that, but I think some translation is going to be important. In your comments, both you, Peggy, and Peter mentioned expectations and confidence a number of times. And I think that's what this is all about. So having a sense of what's coming, what that process is important, but the confidence is the process. The confidence is not just about the product. We talk about vaccine confidence. It's really about the whole piece of it. It's to have confidence in the process by which it was researched and worked its way through a regulatory frame. Do you have a process in those who make recommendations? Do you have a process that your physician has the information? So I think those are some of the highlights here. And and this is a critically important stage, but it needs to be translated. I think particularly for the healthcare professionals, the ones who will be holding the syringes need to be able to answer questions. And maybe more than anybody else in the system, they need to be prepared to know what happened, to know what the data is. At least they don't need to know every data table, but they need to know enough about what the basis of a decision was and why the recommendation is what it is. I fear that unless those who are in the usual role of being the trusted advisors on medicine don't feel confident themselves, that's going to carry over to their patients.
Yeah, and to get there, just to follow up on this, you've highlighted the importance of transparency, both in results. You highlighted the advisory committee meeting, which is a chance, as you know, for the company's data to be presented, and also for the FDA's critical review of all that data to be presented, and then expert discussion. And I'm sure in this case, like you said, with the bright spotlight, a lot of discussion around that. Peter also alluded, I guess, within legal limitations to what sounded like a potential further written guidance about the emergency use process and that how that would fit in. Are there other steps you think going forward that will help get that information out that, like you said, clinicians and other individuals that people trust, the experts that they trust, will have the information that they need about supporting decisions on using the vaccines?
Everybody in this panel knows a lot of how it works. I mean, you've got lots of viewers here, and hopefully many more who aren't on right now will have a chance to see this. I think another important message to everybody is that it doesn't end with some stamp of approval and going forward. That another part of that process, the continued follow-up. Do these products work as they were demonstrated in the clinical trials? That's an important piece of it, and to continue to look. So I think another piece of that is to demonstrate to all that we have done everything possible to make the most robust vaccine safety monitoring system available. Peter mentioned a couple of pieces of that. The CDC has some parts of that. The Defense Department has a piece. CMS can. I think it's important that the government broadly, along with the manufacturers who have access to that data and maybe other clinical trial sites, wherever you're going to get them, we need more than any other time in history to have the best safety monitoring system once a vaccine is used largely in the population, so we can continue to look at it.
Great. Great. Thank you very much, Bruce, for joining us. We look forward to continuing to work with you and getting this kind of transparency and clarity that you've said is so important. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Gruber. Marion, you've heard the discussion so far, the points that Peter made, and the additional issues that Bruce raised. Any place you'd like to start? You're at the helm of overseeing this this regulatory process. Any other issues that you'd like to highlight that are front of mind for you that I'm sure everyone would be interested in hearing about?
Sure. I actually wanted to emphasize something that Peter touched on. He actually quite nicely tried to describe the differences between an issuance of an EUA and the standards that we need to meet and the approval of a biologics license application, and the difference there. I wanted to actually make one point that I think is important, because you, Mark, in the beginning of this broadcast showed a slide where we saw that how many vaccine manufacturers are in active clinical development, how many entered phase 3 clinical studies, and hopefully we'll get a signal of efficacy from some of these soon. And there, of course, comes the discussion on could we then potentially, even based on an interim efficacy signal, issue an EUA. And Peter made the point that, looking at COVID-19 vaccine construct, and if we issue an EUA, then we would potentially expose millions of uninfected individuals, healthy people, to this vaccine. And so we need data to support the benefit of the vaccine. And these data need to be very close to those that we need to meet the effectiveness standard. And I think that's one point I wanted to make. So the data that we would really derive from an interim efficacy analysis would have to meet the same efficacy standards that the primary endpoint in the final analysis would meet. And Peter spoke to this, efficacy of at least 50% with the lower bound of the alpha adjusted confidence interval around the point estimate of greater than 30%. And the point that I wanted to make is we think it is important to align these safety and effectiveness standards very closely so that we can ensure that issuance of an EUA for a COVID-19 vaccine would not interfere with the ability of an ongoing phase 3 trial to demonstrate effectiveness of the vaccine to support licensure and also to continue to investigate the safety of the product. So I think that that was an important point. I thought
that's a really important point to highlight about. It sounds like very close alignment in terms, certainly the effectiveness endpoints, but also you highlighted the importance of having as complete safety data as possible too, that comes with continuing the trials far enough to get those effectiveness endpoints. I'd like to bring in Rob Califf now. Rob, you've been in the commissioner's chair too and have overseen a lot of these issues in trial design in your career prior to and after FDA. Part of the dialogue, any questions that you'd like to ask Marion?
Yeah, let me make, Mark, if it's all right, let me make 5 real quick points, and 2 of them lead to questions for Dr. Gruber. First, I would like to reiterate what you all have said. I mean, Peter and his team are first rate. I had the privilege of appointing Peter to his jobs after a search, so I got to know him quite well. And, his integrity is beyond reproach, and I think he's made it clear what he's going to do. And I'm glad we're having this session to shed light on what was already planned. Secondly, it's been still surprises me, and it shouldn't, how few people actually know how clinical trials work. A lot of people like to talk about clinical trials. There are not that many that have actually done them. And I'm writing a blog right now just to lay out all the layers of people involved that would somehow have to be corrupted if this process was to be corrupted. It's really an extraordinarily robust clinical trial system that's been set up in this case. And I think it should give us a lot of confidence that the data will be the right data. Interpreting the data, sometimes can be difficult, but I really don't think people need to worry that something fundamental is going to be done wrong in terms of the trials themselves. And, what I write will be publicly available. People may find it of interest. The second, the 3rd and 4th points, efficacy outcomes come in different flavors. So when you say 30% reduction with a lower confidence interval of 50, there are asymptomatic infections, and there's also the clinical course for those who did get infected, like the influenza vaccine, that probably will be some data that will be of interest. So I'd be really interested in how Dr. Gruber plans to look at that. And then those of us who've done a lot of clinical trials, if you focus on the efficacy endpoint, you can get that in real time. And I really appreciate what you said. It's important for people to know that the primary efficacy endpoint won't be different than what you would have in another trial, because you can get that quickly. But the safety database is often a lot harder to fill in, because you got to go look at these cases and track down other information. we frequently in the clinical trials business call it a cheap suit phenomenon. You fix one thing in the database and then you have other issues. So how you will deal with the trailing safety data in the face of an EUA, I think, is a issue a lot of people have raised out of interest. Then the last point I want to make is just one related to my current job. I just want to say that the Google search and YouTube are the most commonly used vehicles for people to get information. We're very committed to making the high priority, high veracity information available, and that's already happening when it's related to COVID. And I would just stress, so much of what needs to be said, and I think Steve already made this point, so much of what needs to be said needs to be translated into common languages, and not just one language, it's every language in the world needs to be included to get this basic information across. So apologize for the length, but I'd be really interested in a little more, and I know others would, in how you plan to look at the sort of more texture related parts of efficacy and safety.
Yeah, Mary, if we go back to you on that, and I also want to highlight Rob's point about the importance of making this information available broadly in all languages, and we're all going to try to help continue to do that. Marion?
Yeah, so let me start with safety follow-up. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement that the duration of follow-up, or at the time of an EUA authorization, is only a few months. Because, because we said before, efficacy could be declared based on an interim analysis of efficacy. And so, that many of the trials, or some of the bigger trials, started the end of July. You look at 2 doses of the vaccine, and you start counting cases after a certain time interval. So it takes some time to even accrue the cases to make an interim analysis. So, but we still would need a reasonable safety follow-up. And the current thinking is, even if we issue an EUA, that we would need a median duration of follow-up of 2 months, as Peter said. But that means that we also need, and we have been in discussions with vaccine manufacturers, that they have contingency planned and adequate plans for safety data collection after issuance of an EUA, so that we can assess any perhaps more uncommon adverse event that may occur later following vaccination. And of course, I made the point earlier on that we also want to assure that the currently ongoing phase 3 clinical safety and efficacy studies can continue to demonstrate effectiveness and to be able to do a final analysis of effectiveness, and also, of course, to accrue more safety data. But and we sort of laid out our thinking there in the guidance document that we published in June. And we also had questions there because if we have a final efficacy analysis, and if we have safety follow-up, let's say 6 months, which is sort of typical for a preventive vaccine, we said in our guidance, subjects should be followed up for at least a year. And there was concern that, well, would we wait that long to approve or accept a BLA, a biologic license application? And the answer to that is no. We think that if we have safety follow-up, let's say for 6 months, in order to approve a BLA or to support a BLA, then we hope that clinical trial participants can still be followed up even after the BLA is approved, to not only look at safety data or long-term safety information and to gather that, but also look for duration of protection and duration of immune responses. We think that's very important. And of course, by issuing an EUA or doing a BLA, we don't really have that long-term follow-up on safety and efficacy and duration of protection. And that is something that we need to capture in adequate post-marketing plans.
So, I'm really glad you said that. I just wanted to also reiterate what Mark said about Sentinel, and Peter emphasized Sentinel and other things. It really started way back in Mark's tenure, and I think all of us commissioners have learned to appreciate this vast post-market system. And we need to do a lot, I think, to help the public understand that there really will be monitoring. Also glad you're talking about the immune response. A lot of people have asked me, will we measure the immune response, because there'll be a lot unknown with this new virus, and it'll give us some clues about where to go. So I'm really delighted with what you're saying here.
Yeah, yeah. So many of the vaccine manufacturers who go into clinical or go into phase 3 clinical trials really will analyze at least a subset of the subjects for immunogenicity. So and that is important, because we also would like to get, markers, potential markers that are predictive for protection out of these trials, right?
So that will include the T cell response that we're all talking about.
The T cell responses. Well, I guess the focus is on neutralizing antibody titers, but that's not to say that T cell response is also important, in particular for some of the vaccine constructs that are currently under evaluation. I wanted to make a point regarding the primary endpoint, or primary efficacy endpoint and the analysis. I mean, across the board, vaccine manufacturers use laboratory confirmed COVID-19 or laboratory confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection. And for these, we are applying these criteria of at least 50% vaccine efficacy with a lower bound of greater than 30%. There are, of course, a number of secondary endpoints that we're also going to be looking at. And for those, the statistical criteria may be a little bit different. There was an important point, I think, made in the beginning of the panel, and that is sort of looking at subpopulations. And we really try to ensure that these phase 3 clinical studies not only enroll younger adults, but also a good proportion of the clinical trial has to constitute of the elderly. And so we said at least 25% of the subjects enrolled in the clinical study should consist of the elderly. And I was actually delighted to see that at least some vaccine manufacturers far surpass that and have as much as nearly half of the subjects in the clinical trial participant consisting of people that are, over 60 years of age. So I don't know if this is going to be enough to really power the study to really make sort of statements about efficacy. I think this would probably an overall efficacy estimate, but it's still, we will hopefully be able to do some sub-analysis in these populations.
Great. Thanks for those clarifications, Marion. I'd like to turn now to Dr. McMurray-Heath. Michelle, a number of the companies that are bio members, in fact, all of the companies that are part of this major U.S. Unprecedented vaccine development effort, had an extraordinary letter out this week saying jointly that they expect to follow the kinds of standards and approach that we've been hearing about today from the Biologics Center staff. Can you say a little bit more about what led to that and what you and your member companies are hoping to see going forward in this process, and how well it aligns with what you've been hearing today?
Of course, of course. Well, thank you, Mark, and thanks for letting us join you in this amazing discussion, and very much needed. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, we represent over 1,000 biotechnology companies, both large and small. And so we really encompass all of the companies that are working on the now 185 development projects to develop a COVID vaccine. So we pay a lot of attention to the 9 that are in phase 3 clinical trials, but we've seen an overall unprecedented response by the industry to try to get as many shots on goal to get an effective vaccine across the finish line. And it's been really breathtaking. But our companies know very well that it's important for the public to have confidence in the process and confidence in the eventual vaccine. We don't want to turn the worried well into the vexed vaccinated. You know, we really need patients to understand the risks that are involved in taking vaccines, but also have confidence in the benefits that will accrue. And so to that end, the last 5 chairmen of bio and myself came together to kind of put some best practices out there in a letter that we issued about a week and a half ago, that really called out, you know, following the FDA guidance, making sure that there's an opportunity for a public advisory committee meeting, which we've heard so much of a great commitment to today, and also calling upon all of our manufacturers to publish their results. We haven't touched on that very much today, but it's been wonderful to see how the scientific journals have really committed themselves to turning around COVID-related publications incredibly quickly. And that gives an opportunity for there also to be some objective consideration of the data that's coming out that's not related to either the manufacturer, the sponsor, or the advisory committee, but independent scientists who are able to really pick apart the data and also testify to their confidence in the data. So we went forward with that, and our vaccine manufacturers wanted to double down on the commitment, and they came out as well and really said, you know, it's important for us to follow all the FDA guidance and to really have robust phase 3 clinical trials, because we know at the end of the day, we, one, are going to need great uptake. And we've seen an erosion of public trust over the last couple of months. We've gone from a public confidence in an eventual COVID vaccine in the mid 50% range down to the low 40s in about 2 months. So it's going to be important for the public to be excited about this, to have confidence in it, to line up to take it so we can get to that coveted herd immunity sooner rather than later. And also to have some patience with the, you know, adverse event rates that we know we're going to see with any medical intervention. You always see some rate of adverse events. So we want people not to panic from that, but to understand what the risks are and what they can do about it.
Marion, thanks very much. And I'm sorry, Michelle, thanks very much. And Marion, just to go back to you, Michelle emphasized the point about transparency and data. Now there's a lot of steps that FDA is taking to make information from the companies available. Anything you'd like to add on how the public's going to get a look at both the data that companies are developing in these trials and FDA's perspective on those findings?
So of course, you know, while these trials are going on under investigation, new drug application, and as we are reviewing, let's say, a biologic license application, we really cannot share the data at that point. But as Peter explained, you know, if we were to take regulatory action, if we were to issue an EUA or a BLA, take regulatory action on the BLA, we would certainly take these data to our advisory committee meeting to have a public discussion. And of course, as part of that, the vaccine manufacturers do generate a briefing document containing their data. The FDA typically issues a briefing document and stating their perspective on the data. And then we have the public discussion. If we actually assume there is a BLA and we take regulatory action and that COVID-19 vaccine is approved, what we're doing is we're putting our review memos, our summary assessment on the FDA web, and people can basically access that and can read about the data, the clinical trials, the safety information, the efficacy information, and the FDA's assessment thereof. So that would be publicly available. There's a little bit of a difference when it comes to the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls information. Some of this is proprietary and some of that information may need to be redacted, but we will also have information on the manufacturing process. And that is another thing, and it's something that I wanted to point out that really plays an integral part in our overall assessment of preventive vaccines in general, and of course also COVID-19 vaccines, because we have to make sure that the manufacturing process by which the vaccine is made ensures the quality of the product and ensures that it can be made consistently and reproducibly. And that's a very important activity at the FDA, together with our colleagues in the Office of Compliance. We really look at the manufacturing process. We look at the facility where the product is made. And that's very important because it's fundamental to assessing the safety of the product.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the point about manufacturing, and just to maybe follow up on that a little bit more, the standards for FDA approval versus EUA with regard to manufacturing. Can you say anything about how those might differ?
Well, you know, we also try to apply very stringent criteria, even regarding the CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, and control information that needs to be available to issue an EUA. We would look really at the information very closely. We want to look at the sites where the product is made. We want to take a look at the facility and see if they meet current good manufacturing practice regulations. We would want to have some more than, you know, one lot made. So we're looking at process performance qualification there, even for an EUA. There is maybe some difference when you look at, usually when we approve a BLA, there's an expectation that the manufacturing process is validated in all aspects, the methods, the methodology by which the product is characterized and made. And some of that information may not be available at the time that an EUA is issued, but that doesn't mean that we will request data to assure us that the product that is used under an EUA meets the expectation for quality. So we have criteria that we will put in place, and we also told and we actually have lots of close collaborations with the COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers ongoing now. They're sending in their packages so that we can take an early look. We told them that as soon as the information is available, to submit this now to their IND, to the investigation new drug application, so that we can have an early look, so that we can point out, you know, gaps or information that we need, so that these things are reasonably in place at the time that an EUA package may be submitted.
Great, thank you. Great discussion. I want to get in a couple more questions. And first, Michelle. So you've talked a lot about the importance of the process. Peter and Marion talked earlier about this being an extraordinary vaccine situation in terms of really trying to target patients who typically aren't in clinical trials that much, elderly, people with a lot of additional conditions, minority communities, people of color. Can you say a little bit more about what the companies are doing to respond to what Peter and I think Marion have emphasized about wanting to see diversity and significant enrollment from a lot of these groups in the trials?
Of course, it's critically important to us at BIO. Just about a month ago, we launched our bioequality agenda and really put clinical trial diversity at the forefront of one of our priorities for BIO. And we've been using kind of the process of the COVID therapeutics and COVID vaccine clinical trials as a test case for that, because it's so important. So we've been linking our vaccine manufacturers with organizations like the National Association of Black Churches and the National Urban League to really try to help with minority enrollment and get those numbers up. We were very gratified to see about a week ago Moderna announcing that they were actually going to slow down their clinical trial a little bit so that they could increase the number of minority participants so that they could have deep confidence that they were really having a diverse trial population. We've got to say that we don't really understand why we're seeing the differences in mortality and morbidity related to COVID among different ethnic populations. Why are African Americans dying from COVID at a rate 3 times their white counterparts, and Latinx patients are dying at a rate twice that of their white counterparts? And because we don't understand the role that the immune system is playing in COVID mortality and the reason we're seeing these ethnic differences, it's even more important than it usually is to have diverse patient populations in clinical trials for vaccines at numbers that really let you do those subpopulation analyses. It's not going to be enough if we can't have confidence that this truly works for all patients. So this is very, very important for us, and we're doing everything we can. And I know some of the trials had a slow start in trying to have diverse patient enrollment, but things are improving, but it needs to get even stronger. And when you see things like a vice presidential candidate saying that they'd be unwilling to take a COVID vaccine, or the mayor of Newark, who actually happens to be the son of a famous civil rights poet, Leroy Jones, actually putting out a statement asking that African Americans in Newark not participate in COVID vaccine trials, then we know that we're up against some really stringent public perception. And we really have to do everything we can to address it head on.
Yeah, really. Rob, I'd like to turn to you for any final thought or maybe a final question for Marion.
Always love to ask my former colleagues at FDA questions. I also, just note Michelle is also a alum of the FDA. So I'd like to make a couple of quick points that, again, have surprised me as I've talked to people that they didn't realize about all this. The FDA is unique in the fact that it actually analyzes the raw data. Other regulatory agencies get summaries, but they don't actually get the raw database. And this is really an essential part of global public health, that this analysis is done by the FDA. So although Dr. Gruber, made the point that the FDA can't release the raw database, the summaries from that raw database really represent independent analysis from the company. And so you have the opportunity for a lot of integrity in the system because of that. I still love the saying that we used to say, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And so a lot of what I'm hearing today, there's just no way around the fact that in the end, people will bring their data to the FDA, it will be publicly aired, and there are always nuances that you didn't expect when you do a clinical trial. So I wonder, Dr. Gruber, if you could say a bit more about, many people are asking the question, if you have let's say trial A hits the mark early on and you've got 8 other clinical trials still ongoing, can you say just a bit more about how the traffic lane making actually can occur in that situation? Because a lot of people will want access to the vaccine and may not want to go into a placebo control, for example.
Yeah, that is a very challenging, difficult question, and I was hoping nobody would ask me that today. But, but of course, it has come up. What if we have an EUA issued for one vaccine, or even have a vaccine that is licensed, and there are other vaccine manufacturers for which the phase 3 clinical studies for their vaccine constructs are still ongoing? And so we actually did have some internal discussions on how to best go about that. I think one of the, there was consensus that of course, clinical trial subjects have the right to withdraw from the clinical studies, and they can, and they can do so. But what we are saying is, even if an EUA is issued, and even if a BLA is licensed, there may not be an imminent availability of the vaccine. There may be, other reasons for why this product is not widely deployable. And so to the extent possible, these phase 3 clinical studies, of course, should ongoing, including a placebo for as long as possible. But there may be situation where this is just no longer possible. And so we actually had our statistics mind going together and saying, is there a possibility to include a comparator arm? So looking at then relative efficacy, but it looks that these trials will be prohibitively too large. I mean, that's probably not feasible to do these studies, but there are probably other approaches that could be used and in order to sort of continue these phase 3 clinical studies. And other than saying we are actively discussing this, we are reaching out to experts to help us with that, but we are tackling this this problem because it's an important one for which we have to have a solution. But it is being addressed. But that's all I want to say at this point.
I appreciate it. Mark, if I can just make two
Uh-huh.
very quick points. I know we're out of
Please.
time. The first is this may be a call to action for all the experts out there to come up with their best ideas just in case. And I know the FDA will make wise decisions. And one of the great things about being at FDA, you could ask an expert to come and they'd pay their own way and be there the next day. I mean, people do want to contribute to this, but also just want to make the point of the extraordinary authority that the FDA is given by the emergency declaration and the EUA. And there's a good reason for it. I'm all in favor of it, but it really emphasizes the need for full-time civil servants to be in control and to make these decisions. And this extraordinary manifesto that came out today from the top of the FDA and the civil service, I think is extraordinarily meaningful. I think it's a great thing that we have people that are not conflicted and can make these decisions for the public health.
Yeah, Rob, thank you. And want to thank all of our panel, Marion, I guess especially you for being there at this critical time in this big and I think increasingly bright spotlight as the work continues on developing the COVID vaccines. So thank you all very much for joining us. And we're not going to leave the issues that we were just talking about. We're now moving in our next session on COVID vaccine distribution, access, and monitoring to more of the very challenging issues about what comes next. As you've heard, we're not going to have all the evidence we'd ideally like to have, whether for a regular approval or any initial emergency use, more limited approvals. We are going to need to get more participation and more evidence on different subpopulations of patients, as Michelle highlighted in the past session. So as we think about those issues, and as we think about what the public really is going to need to know to have confidence in vaccines, given all that we've talked about, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for the next session, Scott Gottlieb, my colleague, former FDA commissioner, current resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and our panelists, Dr. Grace Lee, professor of pediatrics and infectious disease at Stanford University, and a member of the advisory committee on immunization practices for the CDC, Amy Tourson at the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy, recently headed state health policy for the National Governors Association, so a lot of expertise on state perspectives and experience in getting vaccine and public health issues addressed. Carlos Del Rio, who's a Hubert Professor and Chair at Emory Vaccine Center at Emory University, also an expert on vaccine access and related issues. And certainly not least, Dr. Stephen Anderson, the Director of the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology at the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA, who is overseeing a lot of these issues related to what happens after vaccines are approved. So Scott, let me go over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks for having me here today. It's a real honor to be here and it's a real privilege to moderate this session with a really outstanding group of people who've been on the front lines of grappling with the challenges that we've faced over the last 7 months. There's been a lot of good discussion today about vaccine availability and particularly what we can do to try to foster use of a vaccine when one becomes available. And as folks know, I'm on the board of Pfizer, one of the companies developing a vaccine, but there's certainly a number of vaccines in advanced development right now, and we hope one or more of them are going to make it over the finish line. You know, one of the challenges in terms of inspiring confidence and trying to inspire utilization is making sure that when we study the vaccine, it's studied in a group that's representative of the people who are ultimately going to be using the vaccine in the general population, and particularly people who are at highest risk of having contracting the virus or having bad outcomes. And that's been a challenge, making sure the vaccine trials are fully representative. And Carlos, you and I were going back and forth on email a little bit last night about this very issue. And I just want to start off with you and sort of start off with what we can do pre-approval, and then get into what we can do post-approval to try to continue to build the evidentiary base. appropriately and inspire confidence among the general population. But what do you think we can be doing now and be doing as we go forward? Because obviously there's a lot of trials now getting underway. There's trials that have been currently enrolled, but there's also trials getting underway. What can we be doing better or be doing differently to try to make sure that we're recruiting a broader population, a more representative population in these vaccine trials, so that the ultimate data set is one that reflects the people who are going to need the vaccine?
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this really excellent event. You know, as was previously said, I think one thing we've seen in this pandemic is enormous racial and ethnic disparities, and this is not the only disease for which there are enormous ethnic and racial disparities. There are others, and my background is in the field of HIV, and you know, we know in HIV there's similar ethnic and racial disparities, and we've seen studies like, for example, you know, recently some of the PrEP studies in which not enough minorities have been included, and when not enough African Americans are included, then you know, we are in a way kind of surprised that there hasn't been a huge uptake of PrEP among African Americans, and that's because they weren't included in the studies to begin with. So a big component of enrolling minorities, besides thinking about could there be a different response, there be biological reasons why they will respond differently, it's really about trust. It's really about building that relationship of trust that then allows people who participated to be the ones that are in the front of the study. They're the sort of trench centers who then will help us get better, better acceptability of a vaccine or intervention like PrEP. So if the studies come out and they're successful and 90% of those enrolled are white and they have a low enrollment of African American and Latinos, you're simply not going to have trust in the community to go ahead and go forward. And we know that because of the disparities, the people that need the vaccine the most are actually minorities. So we have to be sure that they're including studies. Number one, because they're the ones that are going to be benefiting the most. Or number two, because it's the right thing to do, simply because if we don't develop the trust, we're always going to be behind in this disease, and we're not going to end the disparities that we're already seeing.
Thanks for that. Just want to turn to the rest of the panel on that same question, see if anyone else wants to offer any thoughts about that before we break into some other questions or any comments. Grace, Hemi.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that. Just speak more broadly about the importance of health equity. I mean, I think it's critical to all the conversations we're having, both before licensure and or approval and afterwards. And everything that we do around recommendations should absolutely incorporate the principles of equity in everything that's being discussed. And that was reflected really beautifully in the National Academies of Medicine report that came out recently, or the preliminary report. I'll also just say that while there's a lot that we can do with regard to recommendations, where the rubber meets the road is really in implementation and how well we're able to implement. So it's not just the recommendation. The recommendation can provide sort of the rationale and the impetus behind what we need to do to implement. But unless we have our implementation partners sort of side by side with us on this, we're not going to be able to address the health disparities in the way that we really want to. And I do think vaccination is a powerful tool to be able to address that, and we have to use it intentionally.
Yeah, and this is Amy. Thanks, Grace. I just wanted to chime in on that too. So, just representing the state and local government perspective, they're on the front lines of implementing a lot of this. And, we all know COVID-19 has been completely unprecedented. And, as Carlos pointed out, there's certainly been disparities in other conditions and disease, but the nature of this and the extent to which it's hit populations is unprecedented. And I think in terms of preparing for how to really gain the trust of the communities, the state and local governments, the public health departments have been on the front lines trying to figure out how to do that. And I think there's continued challenges. So I know we're going to talk more about this, Scott, but this discussion about ensuring safety and efficacy. I mean, we've all seen the statements coming out from the state health officials and the immunization managers about there has to be a safe vaccine. There already is so much distrust about the vaccine on its face, especially with communities of color. If it's going to work, if the states and local governments are going to be able to persuade people to actually get the vaccine, the safety is most important. And I think there's a real challenge about communication. I was talking to some state officials yesterday, and they were talking about, okay, we have to prepare, right? Implementation, distribution is going to take a lot of time. to prepare. And, they've been given November 1 deadlines for certain things and trying to get ready. And really getting the trust of the public is really going to have to be a partnership across the federal government, the manufacturers, providers, states, local governments, et cetera. So,
Steve, I don't want to put you on the spot with respect to these particular vaccines, but just generally speaking, how does the agency think about this, and what do you think are there things sponsors can be doing to try to drive more enrollment of populations that are underrepresented in these trials, that are sort of best practices that you would be recommending now or talking about?
Yeah, so I will say that, the post-market surveillance is really more my area. So driving enrollment in clinical trials is probably less so. But I think you need to reach out to the communities that you're targeting for enrollment in the trials, and really do the positive outreach to bring those groups of people into the studies, because I think it's really critical. And good communication overall with those communications is really important. I mean, I'm sorry, that's the best I can really say at this point.
That's helpful. I appreciate it. Carl,
let me add just two things. Number one is, I think one mistake that we've done, and one thing that I want to caution people is, we're in such a fast mode. We want to get this done quickly. And when you're talking about enrolling minorities, it takes time. You have developed that trust, and enrolling minorities takes time. And I think a mistake we've made is saying, we got to get this done quickly. So we're all, as investigators, going for the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit are not minorities, because those are harder to enroll. So the reality is, we need to be careful that we do the trial correctly. And sometimes you have to slow down the trial in order to enroll the right populations. And that's something that I would say is, don't let speed be the enemy of doing the right thing.
What does that look like in a practical sense when you actually try to go into the community and do targeted enrollment of people who are harder to reach? I know you run a lot of trials, and what does that actually look like for folks?
It looks like, first of all, I need to hire people that work with me who are the outreach community, that look like the community. They need to be able to blend into the community, that look like the community. If I go and speak to, an African-American church, I mean, I don't get very far. But if I get, one of the African-American preachers to then go at the church and speak and say, I'm enrolling in this study, I want to encourage people to enroll, then that's a different story. So we need to get people that look like them to really be advocating, to really be answering the phone, to really ideally be also part of our research team, the nurses, the research coordinators, the investigators. Number two, you really need to speak to the community in a very open way. And I think you need to acknowledge the mistakes of the past. You need to acknowledge, Tuskegee. You need to acknowledge all the different things that create mistrust in the community. And then you need to go in there and answer the community needs. So, for example, in many communities that I've gone to, what people want is more access to COVID testing. They don't get it. So, so my team is out there doing COVID testing, outreach to the community as a way to gain the community trust, so then people can enroll in studies. So it's really building a net that is more than just getting the one individual and pretending, just because you gave out a pamphlet, people are going to enroll. It's really responding to what are the needs of the community and how do they blend with your needs as an investigator to enroll minorities.
Can I turn to you and Grace? Just any thoughts you have to offer about just the sort of practical things? I mean, Carlos really broke it down real well. Anything additional that we should be thinking about as we proceed?
I just wanted to pick up on one point that Carlos mentioned, which is really about, access to testing. And that's something that emerged in part because we were trying to stand up all the implementation efforts across the country simultaneously. But I think that actually sort of revealed some weaknesses and gaps in our systems, and thinking purposefully and intentionally about how to make sure we're able to get the test to communities that are actually really impacted by COVID. And I feel the same way about vaccine implementation. When we're thinking about vaccine campaigns, we really need to make sure that we are ensuring accessibility to communities that are really impacted by COVID.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Grace. And one thing I would add is, we had this fantastic discussion about, the steps that FDA is taking to make sure that the vaccine is going to be safe and effective. Most people don't follow all of the things that FDA does. And so really making sure the public, especially these communities that we're trying to reach, understand. And when I say understand, like in a way that makes sense to them, with messengers that make sense to them. How do we break down, like, okay, what are we really doing with the vaccine? How are we testing? What does that mean? What is going to be the outcome of this? How can that benefit you and your community? What is the goal that we're trying to achieve, and how are we trying to make everyone safe while we do it? You know, I think that real practical way of talking about things, you know, that an average person who's not following what the FDA is doing and, you know, what the CEOs may be writing about can really trust and understand. I think it's a really important piece of this. And I will say, from a state and local government perspective, there's a lot of concern about how to talk to the public about this in a way that they understand. And, you know, they want to remain trusted messengers, and with so much uncertainty, there are things that I think they're struggling with, so.
I want to just, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the distribution and then focus the balance of the time around the post-market. And Hemi, you mentioned some of the issues around states thinking about the distribution. I think that's been a little bit of a black box for some folks in terms of what the distribution is going to look like here. You know, how much control is the government going to exert, and what the sort of access points are going to be. I mean, the initial EUA, the initial authorization is likely to be an EUA, could be pretty narrow, and so the distribution points could be pretty self-evident. If the, you know, EUA initially is for healthcare workers and people in nursing homes, it becomes pretty obvious what the distribution points are going to be. But beyond that, you know, there might need to be the creation of some infrastructure. Do you have any insight into what that looks like, or is anyone that you can share about what the distribution would look like and how people are going to get practical access to this? Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute. Hemi, I think you're on mute.
Hemi, you're muted.
We, you know, make sure that we get the licenses approved, what else needs to be done, and there's a date out there, right, November 1. I think the second piece is states are being asked to submit their vaccination plans as well. Now, they originally had to have it done by October 1. There's been an extension. You know, CDC has to issue more guidance, and then there'll be 30 days after that. But still, that's pretty short term. And, you know, when states are given a directive, they worry about it, and they're really trying to put things together. And so that plan has to include things like, you know, who are the priority populations, where are the distribution sites going to be, how is your staff going to be able to educate and administer, and so a lot of operational pieces. How is the data and reporting going to work? But you have to put a plan together without knowing a lot of these pieces, right? Like, how many vaccines are they going to get? Who's going to be prioritized? How are these trials going to actually pan out in terms of who's going to be, you know, targeted first? And so I think there's a lot of concern on the state side of how do we do this right? How do we get all of these pieces in place and be ready when we don't know a lot of the information, and at the same time we're trying to communicate to the public effectively. So I'll just say from a very practical perspective, there's, I think, going to be some bumps in the road, obviously, and I think, you know, continued transparency from the federal government and partnership for the states and locals is going to be really important, and resources as well. So,
Carlos, do you have any insights, or Grace, because you guys are on the front lines? Have you had any contact with folks on this?
You know, I really have not talked to the state, but I've been thinking a lot about this. And one of the things that I think we need to mention, Scott, is the need for a cold chain refrigeration requirements. Many of those vaccines, you know, I don't know, but many of those vaccines require -70 refrigeration. We simply don't have -70s in most clinics. In fact, we don't have refrigerators or freezers. You know, this has been one of the challenges, for example, with the Zostavax vaccine, that actually it needs to be frozen and then you unfreeze it, and then that has limited the availability and distribution because, you know, clinics don't have it, or by the time they thaw it, the patient is gone. So I think even you have to think down to the level of refrigerator. How are you going to deal with it? Which vaccines, what kind of freezers do you need to have? Are we going to build an infrastructure for cold chain? So some of the issues are really going to be very tricky. And what are you going to do? Some are going to be obviously primary care center clinics, but you're going to have to get out to communities. You're going to have to get out to places of work. I mean, you've got to, you know, meat packing places, places of gathering, places where people congregate. And how do you get vaccine to really those that are, I mean, we talk a lot about the term hard to reach populations, and I don't like the term. I always say that rather than hard to reach, they should be called hardly reached populations. You know, we don't reach those populations frequently. Well, now you're going to have to reach those populations because we can't wait for them to come reach us. If we have an effective vaccine, we're going to have to go to the populations. And that's going to require, again, a very different kind of vaccine distribution and a very different way of thinking about it. I think about the way we've done polio or the way we did smallpox. You know, you really have to have a very different way of planning the vaccine output as you get this together.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the cold chain. I think that the manufacturers are thinking very hard about this, how they can provide for that cold chain storage right up into the point of care. This isn't a vaccine that's going to be entering an established distribution channel where you can just sort of push it out to a distributor. You're going to have to, if you're a manufacturer, think about how to ensure safe custody of that vaccine all the way to the point of care in a cold chain. It really is about the cold chain storage. Grace, anything to add there? And then I want to turn next to talking about, the balance of the time talking about the post-market, what the sort of stage introduction is likely to look like, and what the data collection scheme is likely to look like after introduction of the vaccine, and turn to Steve a little bit for that. But Grace, anything to add about the sort of practical issues with the distribution, anything that you've gleaned in your discussions with folks?
Well, I will say that obviously planning is underway, but it's really hard to do planning without specifics. So the specifics that Carlos just mentioned are critical in thinking about how we're going to actually be able to distribute vaccine. And I'm thinking more at a local level, not specifically at the national level. And I should also mention that I am here as an individual, although I am on ACIP. I did want to make a few comments, if that's all right.
I was gonna turn to you on ACIP,
So just, for the audience, as many people know, after a vaccine is licensed by the FDA with specific indications for use based on clinical trial data, ACIP then deliberates on recommendations for use in the US civilian population. And as a federal advisory committee, ACIP members have that expertise across the life cycle of vaccines and the committee represents clinical, public health, and consumer perspectives. Our deliberations about the recommendations do occur in open meetings, similar to what was discussed for FDA, to ensure transparency, and public comment is an important part of that process. Once vaccines are licensed or authorized for use by the FDA, ACIP will consider specific recommendations for use in the general population, as we typically do following any FDA licensure approval. And regardless of the pathway to approval by FDA, ACIP will continue to use the evidence to recommendations framework, or the ETR framework. It allows us to have a standard process for deliberation and transparency on key aspects of decision making. So in that framework is not only the science, but also values and resource use, as well as implementation issues. And we obviously want to consider the entirety of that, in part because implementation can affect recommendations. We want science driving the recommendations, but we have to be cognizant that implementation issues are there. The couple key points I want to just highlight specifically are related to the clinical trial data and then to post-market safety surveillance systems. So first, the clinical trial data, I personally think are going to be critical for decision-making, and especially around safety. The phase 3 studies that are designed for a rapid evaluation of efficacy are actually also designed for safety. I mean, these trials range from 30,000 to 50,000 participants in each trial. And we haven't seen these numbers for vaccines since the rotavirus vaccine trials, when people were worried about the risks of intussusception following vaccination. So having that complete information about the safety profile of each vaccine candidate will be extremely important for decision making. In addition, ensuring the clinical trials remain intact, and this is going to be very challenging and incredibly important, whether or not an EUA occurs. These randomized clinical trials will give us the best possible information on long-term safety issues, such as vaccine-enhanced respiratory disease. And a particular ethical challenge posed by an EUA is whether those trial recipients, as was mentioned previously, would receive placebo, should be offered those vaccines. This would impact our ability to assess the long-term safety and long-term effectiveness. So I think it's going to be a really hard thing to know how to handle. And then I'll just turn now to the post-market safety surveillance. And I did, I'm really excited Steve is on today, because I think this will be a critical component of the COVID-19 vaccine program for the US. The US has had well-established safety surveillance systems for actually several decades, and that will remain the cornerstone of COVID-19 vaccine safety monitoring, including VAERS and VSD as two particular systems. But there are a couple of key points that are specific to COVID-19 vaccine safety surveillance that I think, I hope this group will deliberate on, and many others. So first is, given the need to use a phased approach to vaccinate the US population, we really need to think about complementing our existing systems with novel approaches to enhance visibility and timeliness in detecting potential safety signals. And I look forward to Steve's comments on this, particularly given FDA's leadership on Sentinel and BEST, in addition to the collaboration with CMS. Second, we'll need to coordinate post-approval safety monitoring efforts through harmonized protocols and outcome definitions to enable timely identification and, more importantly, timely evaluation of those signals. So there's some components to that we could dive deeper into. And then finally, we really need to have a well-developed communication plan that ensures the public, as was mentioned multiple times today, understands how we monitor vaccine safety and how to ensure that transparent, timely, and accurate communication occurs as safety considerations emerge, either based on data or based on media reports. So we should be anticipating that our systems are designed to detect these safety signals. And we want systems that detect safety signals. That's the whole point of having these safety systems. It's how we handle those signals that'll define our ability and our responsiveness to COVID. So I think not enough can be said about how important this communication is. And I'm glad Carlos is on today to help us discuss those issues as well.
Great, so thanks a lot. That was outstanding. I want to just turn to Steve and pull him into this conversation because I do want to move on to thinking about the post-market. We talked a little bit about how to ensure a good data set pre-market and a little bit about the distribution. Now, sort of you have a vaccine, it's being made available. How do we make sure we continue to learn about it and monitor it in the post-market? I think if this is made available under an EUA, which seems the most likely scenario, and frankly, the EUA process was sort of designed for the situation that we find ourselves in. The FDA has a lot of authorities to require post-market data collection under the auspices of the EUA. The FDA is given a lot of latitude under the EUA to impose sort of condition of approval types of requirements. And you could conceive of the agency almost requiring people who are given initial access to a vaccine under an EUA to be enrolled in some kind of prospective registry. The agency's discretion and authorities are pretty broad. Steve, separate yourself from this specific scenario if it's easier for you to talk about in an abstract, but can you talk a little bit about what the framework looks like for post-market data collection, particularly as it might pertain to an EUA type of setting, to the extent that you've thought about those issues?
Yeah, so we have authorities in many of these areas, and I think largely the CDC has responsibility for distribution, and so I think a lot will rest on them as well, and we're working closely. I think there's a lot of interactions and a lot of collaborations between us, CDC, CMS, VA, and government agencies. And so I just wanted to sort of start with that. And I think what we're thinking about as far as enhanced tools, meaning CDC, from my understanding, would be, they would try to have a vaccine, some sort of vaccine administration management system available so that it can be used. I'm not sure you can force people to enroll. It's mandatory, but you can certainly have it available for those and collect data that way. They're also talking about tools that could be used, like email, computer, text-based types of tools. Those would collect, record the administration, and then the ability to kind of do the electronic follow-up, because I think it's also important to kind of be able to ping somebody and say, you're ready for your second dose. So getting those kind of prompts and which vaccine you should be getting for that second dose, just clarifying that, I think will be very helpful. You can also send them prompts to say, hey, how are you feeling today? Any adverse events? And you can do that, for a number of days out after vaccination. Just to try to collect information. And then we're talking about having a list of adverse events that they can go down and click, and trying to make it as easy as possible and least burdensome. The other thing too is trying to do, so under an EUA, payment is challenging. So patients won't be paying for the vaccine. So how do you get the information into the healthcare system if there's not a claim? And so we're talking about trying to implement a no-cost medical healthcare claim so that data does get into the healthcare systems, and that will be especially important for administrations through some of the larger healthcare organizations. And absent that, we'll also be monitoring with CMS data, special populations like long-term care facilities, nursing homes, and those types of populations where they'll probably get be one of the first in line to get the vaccine, and we can closely monitor them. And we have near real-time capabilities with CMS data. So I think that that will be very helpful. And CMS data is very powerful, I think, in this situation for being able to monitor under an EUA or under a licensed product. And so I'll just move into kind of our active surveillance system. So CMS is one of our workhorses, so we'll be getting data probably in, as I said, near real time, streams of data coming in probably every 2 to 3 days, and be monitoring that for particular adverse events. What we would plan to do is what would be called rapid cycle analysis. And planning for this is difficult because you have to pick, we'll probably pick anywhere from 10 to 20 adverse outcomes to be monitoring. And that has to be informed, of course, from the phase 3 safety data, as well as we have some historical data on outcomes like Guillain-Barré syndrome, and obviously transverse myelitis that's in the news. And so many of those that we have from historical, from H1N1 and other vaccines, that we can also be monitoring for. And then that's a living list where we can change it in our monitoring systems, you know, on that near real time basis. So monitoring those outcomes in this population. And then CDC is doing the same thing in the vaccine safety data link system. So there's coordination there. And then we would do validation and verification of any signals in some of the larger data systems that we have in Sentinel. And also some of the new data partners we're bringing on board. I also just wanted to mention, Grace made a point about, you know, it is important to generate sort of common protocols, master protocols, you know, and provide templates for safety, because we're going to be having rapid cycle analysis protocols, but we're also going to be having, you know, inferential study protocols to do epidemiological studies. And so we want to have protocols. And so we're in the process of developing those, coming to the end stages of doing that. And our hope would be, after internal discussion, maybe discussion with ACIP members about those protocols, then posting those for public comment for 2 weeks. And then we would hope to finalize those in time for them to be implemented in the federal systems. And then we're also talking about, we have access to VA data too. VA is a wonderful partner. They have access to 10 million patients enrolled in their EHR system. So it's a very high quality system that we also have access to. DoD is a partner as well. So I can go on, but I think I'll stop there and see if there's questions, Scott.
I'm gonna ask 2 quick follow-up questions of you, Steve, and then I'm gonna ask the other panelists if they have specific questions for you, because it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to confer with you and see if they have any comments on what you said. But one quick question is, and you might have addressed this, and I might have missed it, but are you contemplating coupling some of the post-market data collection that you've talked about with also registries that you would, or other sort of almost condition of approval types of requirements on the manufacturers, where they would have to enroll prospective registries around the patients who are getting access to a vaccine under an EUA? Is that something under discussion?
Yeah, so I think that will come, as Peter had mentioned in his talk about pharmacovigilance planning. So that'll come in the biological license application process, but that also can be done in the EUA process, where we can request, or we can require the manufacturer to sponsor a registry type system if needed. And then again, I think CDC is trying to approximate a registry with their system as well. And so I think, yes, those are important capabilities. And then yes, we are trying to set those up, and we'll be discussing those with manufacturers as well.
One other question, you mentioned 10 to 20 adverse events that you might be monitoring for post-market, and the importance of looking at the clinical data from the vaccine trials to try to derive what you'd be monitoring for. You know, it's at least, Grace talked about the antibody-dependent enhancement as being one theoretical risk associated with these vaccines. You know, another theoretical risk is that we've seen now a lot of sort of post-viral syndromes with COVID infection that seem almost inflammatory, autoimmune-like. We're not sure that there is a causal relationship, and we're not sure the etiology, whether they're sort of immune-mediated post-viral syndrome. Certainly with multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, it appears to be that way. but there's at least a theoretical risk that the epitope that's triggering some of these post-viral conditions that we're seeing is the same epitope we're using in the vaccine. It's the exposure to the spike protein that somehow is having an untoward effect on the body in a certain small percentage of patients. Is there, when you're looking at the kinds of adverse events that you're going to be monitoring for, you're looking mostly at the clinical trial data, or you're also looking at the clinical experience of patients with COVID and thinking about what the correlation could be between that epitope and some of those conditions that you're seeing?
That's exactly right. So I think, Grace, I think this is for ACIP, where I think we need to look at those lists very carefully, because we have this list of, say, 20. I would say there's at least a good half dozen, 6 to 8 on there that are some of the conditions you're mentioning, Scott. And so, yes, and thromboembolic events and on and on. And so, yes, I think those are under consideration. I think the challenge for us is we need to prioritize those in importance. And we don't know how many are going to come from the clinical trial data. So there may be many out of that as well. But I think you raise a good point, which is, we need to consider the COVID-specific outcomes as well.
Grace, Carlos, Hemi, I just want to turn it back to you, see if you have specific questions for Steve as well, and any comments about, about the post-market condition and what you think we should be trying to achieve. Grace, particularly you, I know you're going to be looking at this data and trying to make decisions upon it. I mean, Carlos, all of you, Carlos, you have to make clinical decisions for your patients based on this information as well.
Yeah, no, Steve, thanks very much. And yes, I imagine like the more that we can actually also have some of these discussions in open meeting via ACIP, I think that will actually be beneficial to not only the collaboration and the partnership across federal agencies and also, and of course I'm speaking for myself, but across federal agencies and also-
Of course you are.
with academic partnerships as well.
Thank you.
But I do think the, that concept of we're going to need broad public-private partnership on vaccine safety issues is going to be an incredibly important one with, all the caveats of the appropriate firewalls in place when they need to be in place. One thing that I think would be incredibly helpful coming from FDA, Steve, would be thinking, and some of us is a little bit pre-licensure, and I think it was alluded to before, was having sort of similar guidance on standards for safety, similar to what we just saw beautifully done in June around efficacy. But just being able to articulate that a priori, I think could be incredibly helpful and powerful. And then the other component is really, as you mentioned, you're already starting to cascade these pharmacovigilance plans out, but being able to actually have a, kind of a blueprint for how we're going to address pharmacovigilance for COVID vaccines, because there are going to be so many vaccine candidates coming down the line. It'll be great to actually have sort of a national plan for thinking about pharmacovigilance in this space. So.
Yeah, so all great points. I think I will highlight transparency. I think that's so critical out of the comments that you mentioned. Making sure we're putting documents out, posting them, getting feedback, either from ACIP or the public as well, I think will be pretty important. So, and then, yeah, we'll have to think about the guidance standards for safety, but we are generating a strategic plan for safety and effectiveness monitoring. I think we talked a lot about safety, but we also have to consider effectiveness. And that gets to antibody enhancement, immune enhancement too, Scott, because that may be sort of an effectiveness type issue, because severe disease may be very hard to detect, because with this disease, there's no cerebral counterpart to cerebral malaria. It'll just be it's going to be looking at more severe cases of disease and elevations in those rates. But getting back to the plan, I think that is something we may put out a shortened version just so people get an idea of the types of activities, because there's a lot going on.
And you may not have a lot of severe events in the clinical trial, since that may be a sort of a post-market question that you're going to need to answer.
Yes, definitely. It's on the radar screen.
So one of the questions that I would have is for Steve and Grace is, I think this post-marketing surveillance is always so important nowadays with technology and everything. I mean, I wonder if there's, again, there'll be ways that people, with social media, we're going to hear about the side effects before anything else. So I wonder, how do we leverage things like social media and other platforms to do a very good post-marketing analysis, not only of side effects, but actually of efficacy, right? I mean, when you start weighing efficacy over time, when you say, somebody says, I got the vaccine, but 2 years later, I'm diagnosed with COVID, or 6 months later, I'm diagnosed with COVID. I think somehow we're going to have to mine a lot of untraditional data in order to really understand what's going on with this vaccine.
100% agree. I actually get a lot of my news from Twitter faster than I get it anywhere else. So, I think your point about, and again, this perhaps I'll bump this back to Mark and Scott. The point about needing a very broad communication plan. Obviously, there's going to be an FDA communication plan, a CDC communication plan, but like this goes beyond that in my mind. This is really about how do we as a country respond, and how do we think about working together to make sure that we're maintaining and enhancing vaccine confidence, because it's not only for COVID vaccines, it's really for all vaccines.
I want to just say one last thing, Grace, because you made me think about this, is when you were talking at your first comments, in the 90s, I was in Mexico, and we were involved in a very intensive campaign of immunization, improving childhood immunization rates, and we got them really, really in the high 90s for many of the sort of typical childhood immunization vaccines. And the Secretary of Health, who was a pediatric infectious disease immunologist, Dr. Kumate, said something that I always think about when I think about health equity. He said something that I always remember. He said, in a country with tremendous inequalities, one thing we need to try to give children of this country is immunological equity. So I think we need to think about the vaccine as a way to give, in this enormous inequalities, immunological equity against COVID-19. And I think if we go from a framework of health equity and how we roll out the vaccine, we're going to be in a very different place.
Great. If I could just leave you all with this one thought. I totally endorse that, and really having a coordinated message, because really to date, the governors and their staff have really at the state level been really shouldering a lot of the individual steps on COVID. And so, on a vaccine plan, having the federal coordination and federal messaging is so important, because right now the states are assuming they're going to have to do it themselves. So I will leave you, Scott and Mark, with that to discuss. So.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Grace, Hemi, Carlos, Steve, and I think that was an excellent point to end on. And Carlos, you articulate things so well in such a compelling way. I really appreciate your comments. I just want to close out and thank Steve for joining us. I think that his being here today really reflects the outstanding leadership of CEDAR and their engagement in this with the community. And I think people lose sight of how many layers of expert review these decisions undergo inside the agency. How many people who are really expert and top in their field are going to be touching this application, weighing in on it, passing judgment, offering their analysis. The process itself has tremendous rigor and integrity to it. And that process, is built up over years of practice. It's built up with dozens of guidance documents that have been issued, regulation. It's been codified in statute. It's been reinforced through successive administrations and the approval and clearance of literally thousands of products. And people like Steve and his expertise represent that process. And I think that is why we should all have confidence in what the ultimate end result here is going to be. So I want to thank you all for joining us. I know you're all really busy. It's been a real pleasure to have this discussion with you today. Thanks a lot. And Mark, I'll kick it back to you.
Great. My thanks to the panelists too. It was an excellent discussion and clearly some important issues ahead. Scott, let me pick up on as we wrap up here, just a few reflections going forward with you would be terrific. Let me pick up on what you were just saying. It's obviously a very well-developed FDA process for how to handle issues like this, but never a spotlight like this. And as Peggy Hamburg said, perhaps the most important set of decisions coming in our lifetimes at FDA. The emergency use authorization process that we talked about, as you said, seems tailored to this kind of environment. On the other hand, because it is so flexible, it really does seem to need a lot of public engagement and transparency to help provide that confidence that the FDA is really bringing its expertise to this unique set of circumstances. You have some thoughts, reflections on where we go from here to help support this kind of effective regulatory process?
Well, I think Peter said earlier today that the agency is probably going to be issuing guidance around the EUA process, and I think that that's going to provide a lot of transparency and insight into how the agency is going to make a decision around an EUA. An EUA here is probably appropriate. The EUA process, as it was conceived by Congress, this kind of scenario was envisioned when Congress created the EUA. There's a perception that it's a lower standard, and that's a fair statement insofar as the EUA, the standard for an EUA is, I believe, may be effective rather than safe and effective, but it doesn't need to be a lower standard. What it really is a flexible standard, and it gives the agency tremendous discretion. And I think the agency is going to impose a high bar for safety and effectiveness here, given that this is a vaccine and it's going to be used in an otherwise healthy population. And there's always been a lot of care and caution paid to the clearance of vaccines because of the way that they're used. But I think what the agency is going to be able to do under an EUA is do a very staged market entry, where we usually think of an approval as sort of a binary event. A product becomes approved for its intended population, typically the studied population, and it's up to the discretion of doctors in terms of how they use that. I think the way the EUA is likely to be rolled out is that you're likely to see a very staged market introduction where, and this is just sort of me speculating, but maybe the initial population is physicians or a certain cohort of physicians who are at higher risk of contracting a disease, and providers generally, and maybe people who are at high risk of a bad outcome, like people who are in nursing homes. And then you're collecting data around that. You're letting the initial data set from the trial mature. You're collecting additional data on the population that's received the vaccine, and then you walk it down. You say, well, now we'll authorize it for maybe everyone over the age of 70. You don't have to necessarily be in a nursing home. We'll broaden the population of providers, and maybe we'll enter in another high-risk group. So you're likely to see that sort of staged market entry until there's a robust enough and mature enough data set that you feel more confident either broadening the EUA or issuing a BLA. And I think a BLA is really a 2021 event. And so you think of the vaccine, almost the availability of the vaccine in 2020, if it becomes available in 2020, and that's still a question, but if it becomes available in 2020, almost using it in a therapeutic sense to try to de-risk certain targeted populations or lower the risk for certain targeted populations, as opposed to the way we traditionally think of a vaccine as generalized use to try to develop herd immunity and end an epidemic. You wouldn't be using it to end the epidemic. You'd be using it to de-risk the highest risk populations and lower the overall morbidity from the epidemic. But I think the EUA process gives the agency tremendous discretion to make those decisions. And I think the transparency you talk about, Mark, is going to be, the agency laying out the sort of objective criteria and answering sort of critical questions. I mean, one question is, how many patients do you want longer term follow-up data in the initial data set before you would issue an EUA? So, let's say you might say, well, we want to have at least 6 weeks of follow-up data after the second dose of the vaccine on at least 5,000 patients before we would issue an EUA. A question like that's a critical question. And I think you're going to see probably the agency speak to those questions in a much more granular way. And I think Peter alluded to that today. Yeah. But I would pause there.
Yeah, and with that stage process, like you're talking about, where you get more and more confidence about the use of the vaccine, we've heard today about some of the particular challenges in this context as well, with the people who are most at risk, including elderly, people with multiple chronic conditions, communities of color, other hard-hit populations. That potentially provides an opportunity to fill in some of those evidence gaps. But those seem real based on the discussions we've had today, and something that also needs a lot of attention going forward.
Yeah, and I think particularly, the older population where you might see this authorized, depending on what you learn from the clinical trials. I mean, if the vaccines are demonstrated to be safe and effective in the clinical trials for that population, that's a population where you'll probably have a lot of unanswered questions, even after the data from the clinical trials, and even though the clinical trials are over-enrolling older patients, because, we know that older patients in certain circumstances are less likely to benefit immunologically from vaccines. And so there'll be a lot of questions about the right dose in that population and how protective the vaccines are. So you're going to want to try to learn as much as you can if it's going to be authorized initially in that population, that certainly would be a target population for trying to authorize it, just because of the extreme excess mortality and morbidity as you move up the age continuum. I mean, age does seem to be the single greatest predictor of adverse outcomes from COVID, independent of anything else here.
And along with that, some special attention to, as we heard about earlier, the minority populations that have been so disproportionately affected. This is going to be a big effort around not just the regulatory process, which needs the kind of transparency and support like we've been discussing today, but also planning for distribution and, as you've highlighted in this last session, the post-market evidence and the evidence collected in conjunction with any emergency use.
I mean, we're going to need to compensate with the post-market data collection for the challenges that we face with the pre-market data collection, and that is most acute around what Carlos talked about, enrolling people from communities of color who are underrepresented in these trials. I mean, even the trials that are doing a good job recruiting patients from communities of color, it still probably is underrepresented relative to the population as a whole, and certainly underrepresented relative to the mortality and the morbidity associated with COVID. And so we're going to need to offset what we had difficulty doing in the pre-market trials with the post-market data collection. I think pay particular attention to trying to get good data there, not just to answer important clinical questions, but build a data set that can give people confidence about using the vaccine.
Well, some very important steps today on these topics, but clearly a lot of work ahead. And speaking on behalf of the other former commissioners who participated, Dr. Califf, Dr. Hamburg, I know that we're all committed to supporting this effort of advancing the FDA's science-based approach to dealing with this unprecedented pandemic and these other critical issues that need to go along with it. I want to also thank, in addition to you and our other panelists, all of our audience and our collaborators on this effort. As you heard, this is a set of issues that states, many other patient groups and other groups that are close to the diverse populations that really are going to be affected by these decisions. They all want to participate in. Friends of Cancer Research, for example, has developed a guide intended to help people understand what's in the emergency use authorization. I think combining that with the work that we've been hearing about here on what it actually means in this context will be very important, but lots of work to do further together. In the meantime, thanks to all of you who joined us today, and please stay tuned. You'll be hearing more about Duke Margolis events. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from Scott Gottlieb and our other collaborators on these topics. For now, have a terrific afternoon and stay well.